This Guy's Garage. Like and subscribe.
I guess, Father D'Souza, I'm going to start with you. Your primary concern right now about challenging the freedom of expression in Canada. I'm not going to talk to you about C11 or C18 or even the online harms bill. I just want to know your view on this, on the freedom of expression, your concerns. You talked about three issues. I'll delve into those in a moment. But overall, what is your concern?
I chose three. The examples I chose were all examples that traditionally, in terms of defending freedom of expression, you have a government statute. And then if you think the statute's limiting your rights, you can appeal to the courts for relief. The examples I gave are ones that make that more difficult because it's not a statutory act. It's a regulatory thing. It's a spending power. And the last example was actually just creating a kind of a lobby for restricting freedom of expression. Some of the other witnesses also address things that don't fall under the realm of a government statute, so professional organizations, universities, etc. So that's why I chose to highlight those things. That seems to be where more of the threats to freedom of expression come today. That's why I highlighted those.
I think the one you highlighted first was interesting. It was the Canada Summer Jobs when this government demanded faith-based organizations to sign off on the attestation. My riding of Saskatoon Grasswood, I had a number of nonprofit organizations that I truly support, and many of them couldn't sign off on the attestation. And I give them credit for it. There was, I give them credit because their moral obligation, they had a moral obligation on this issue that, yes, they could have taken the money. Yes, they could have given Canada Summer students an opportunity, but many of them did not. And to me, I was very proud of them, to be honest with you. I dealt with them for many years. Like I said, my first one is nonprofits. Whether in my community, nonprofits are struggling right now, and they've struggled in the past. So when they said thanks, but no thanks, that spoke a lot about the organizations, if you don't mind me saying. Just comment on that, because you did mention that off the top.
I did. I would just make a distinction. The example I used was actually not a faith-based group. It would be just a generic landscaping company. Everybody was required to make that attestation in the first instance. It does touch for some on freedom of conscience and religion, as it may have for some of the faith-based groups, but it was a requirement the requirement for that program was that you had to express an opinion. It happened to be an opinion on a specific subject in agreement with the government's policy, but the very fact that you had to express an opinion to qualify is itself a violation of freedom, thought, opinion, and belief. So that was the problem there. You're right, it put some groups in the position of having to make a difficult choice, and those who made a principled choice, I would share your view, required some courage to do so, but they shouldn't have to be in that position. The difficulty there was that redress against that was very difficult. Had it been a statute, you could have gone to court and maybe got an injunction right away. It's possible. I mean, we'd have to see whether that was possible. But when it becomes a attestation, part of the apparatus of the application process, redress was very difficult. Now, there were later some court initiatives, and then later there was a revision. But if the government passed a law saying that you had to make that attestation, you could have been in court the next day to seek relief and maybe have got, if the judge agreed, some kind of injunction. But this is a more nebulous requirement and therefore harder to seek redress.
I have three major hospitals in the city of Saskatoon. One is a faith-based Catholic hospital, St. Paul's. They don't believe in MAID, and they will not do that. And just your thoughts on that, because they've been run by the nuns in the past, and they're faith-based, they're a Catholic hospital, a very integral part, I would say, of our city, and I give them credit also on the MAID. spoke out right away. They did not agree with this. Just your thoughts on, and there's been some backlash in our city towards them because of their position on this, but just your thoughts on that.
Well, that I think, would come under the primary freedom outlined in the Charter, which is freedom of conscience and religion. Freedom of expression comes in the second part of the fundamental freedom. So I would agree that they should not be coerced against their conscience. In that case, my concern here was actually more in professional associations where what a doctor, physician, a nurse, pharmacist, whoever might even say is being policed, not because of the professional competence of that medical practitioner, but because of the view that in this case, the professional body might take. And that power is given to them by the government. So they hold that livelihood of that professional in their hands. So in fact, in a way, a professional body has more power over it than maybe the provincial government, which has more blunt instruments. But to limit your livelihood is a pretty powerful power given to regulatory professional bodies. And when you seek redress against them, it's harder because courts give them more deference because of what they're supposed to be doing is professional regulation than they would to the government if the government did the same thing.
Thank you. My 6 minutes is up.
Thank you.
One of the things that has troubled me is that there has been a consistent pattern among the Conservative Party of voting against the rights of us LGBTQI plus Canadians, whether it was the consistent sort of votes against conversion therapy or running a candidate in the by-election right now in Cloverdale, Langley City that has said, quote, "You can pray the gay away." These types of tropes, these types of ideas that trans people have mental health disorders, which is a quote from the Conservative Party convention in 2023. In my view, while expressions of while people are using their freedom of expression, I think have a profoundly negative impact on the LGBT community. Can you share a little bit from your work of what you have seen when politicians engage in rhetoric like that and put their names on ballots? What message that sends?
Absolutely. I have been disappointed to see the trajectory of Canada's Conservative Party in recent years. I remember, I think it was Michelle Rempel and it was Deputy Leader Melissa Lanceman, who have both been proponents of bringing the Conservative Party into the 21st century and shedding this legacy of homophobia and transphobia. And I miss those days. I remember seeing that evolution when marriage equality, when a opposition to marriage equality was removed from the Conservative Party policy book. And then I looked on with dread when at their last convention, we saw 2 anti-trans policies passed with overwhelming support and no conservative members of parliament speaking out in opposition. We've seen no conservatives speak out with Premier Smith denying healthcare access to trans kids and their families, with her government literally putting itself between parents and the healthcare that their kids need. And so the impact is, folks living in fear, the reinforcement of stigma and shame, and many generations of queer and trans people grew up in schools and communities that taught us to hate ourselves. And it's only in the last decade that we've seen that shift. But now this period of backlash is recreating that environment of stigma, of hostility. And, I can't stop thinking about the mom in Alberta who might have to leave her province to get her kid access to healthcare. I can't help think about the kid in Saskatchewan who simply wants to be themselves and is hearing a schoolyard bully parrot the language of their premier in order to mistreat and bully that child. And so I hope that the Conservative Party comes into 2024 and stops taking issue with my community who simply want to be ourselves, to contribute to society, and make Canada a country where freedom includes everybody.
You talk about freedom, and I would love your thoughts, because this is something that I have never really understood. Why are conservatives so triggered by pronouns?
I wish I knew. I think, there is often this oversimplification. I'm stumped, honestly. I'm stumped on why. At the end of the day, it is it's basic dignity and basic respect. I like to joke. I have a trans spouse and I've screwed up their pronouns and we still got married. The world did not end. People make mistakes, but what's happening right now is they're trying to use these as wedge issues. They're trying to use these to propagate fear and to create this illusion that we're pushing an agenda. My agenda is the same agenda that gay people and trans people have been pushing forward for generations. And that is one where society stops discriminating against us, where we stop experiencing socioeconomic disadvantage. There's nothing radical about that agenda. There is simply the idea of extending this dream of what Canada can be to include a new group of Canadians.
Well, I mean, I would argue that it isn't a question of new or old. I mean, I think if we're all equal and we all have the right to be who we are, some people have the right to be ignorant. Some people have the right to do whatever they feel. I guess the question at the end of the day, and I know that there are some really good people on this committee, and I from all parties, and I do enjoy serving with them. What would you say to them? What would you say to them as an opportunity to go back to their party leadership and members of their party who have increasingly taken positions that are certainly anti-trans? And it's an easy community to bully, right? It's a small community, and you've historically been part of a community that's not had the same protections and freedoms afforded to you. What would you say to them? What would you say to them on behalf of kids, on behalf of adults, on behalf of members of the trans community? Who just want to be left alone?
I would say speak with us and don't speak over us. I would say listen to the voices of trans people and understand what's at stake. There are many conservatives who I think are reticent around this direction for the party. And I think that many don't understand what's really going on here. There is a powerful anti-LGBT lobby. It's tied into a powerful anti-choice lobby. And they're trying to use trans people as a scapegoat to mess with access to reproductive health care, to legitimize government putting itself between, again, young people or families or everyday Canadians and healthcare that social conservatives simply disagree with. They're using trans people and anti-trans rhetoric to normalize overriding the Charter-protected rights of Canadians. That includes, yes, queer and trans people. That also includes workers. That includes racialized Canadians and people of various faiths. And so I hope that folks understand what is at stake here. Because yes, it's my community's equality and rights. But if you allow one community to be stomped on in an environment polluted by hate speech, it takes away the rights of everybody.
And in the last minute that I have left, or short less than the minute that I have left, I would like to go back to Ms. Al-Azam. You've just heard...
Mr. Nur Mohammed, you do not have a minute left.
I wanted to get right into the fact that this conversation about a freedom of expression and the protection of it, I think that we need to be very careful about the legal limits to the freedom of expression and that it doesn't devolve into hate speech. Now, Ms. Johnson, you were very specific in terms of, and very clear in terms of what's occurred, what you've seen, the dangers that have existed for you because you have, because of who you are and how you identify, but the dangers that have evolved because of a great deal of extremism and hate speech coming forward. Ms. Al-Azam, you have been an incredible spokesperson in our community after the terrorist attack that happened to our London family, and I know that has come at a great consequence in many cases as well because of the dangers and the violence that you have seen, that both of you have seen, and you've both mentioned the use of dog whistle politics, of politicians using that against people in minorities, vulnerable people. And I would love for both of you to explain, because you've also both mentioned the use of the notwithstanding clause and the dangers of those uses by politicians. So I'd love to hear both of you talk about the impacts of that and the dangers of that and the use of either Islamophobia being used for political gain or the attacks on transgender people, LGBTQ2 plus folks, and what that means, the impacts on both those groups.
Who would like to go first?
Sorry, Ms. Johnson, if you could go first, and then Ms. Al-Azam.
Ms. Johnson?
Absolutely, and thank you so much for the question. I think we are seeing, it ties into the previous question. We're in an era of polarization where I think Canadians are having a harder time paying their bills, making ends meet, and supporting their families. And when you have that environment where life is harder, it becomes easier to channel that anger and to take advantage of that anger to gain power. I think in Canada right now, we're seeing this language around, so-called parental rights, this reference to gender ideology. And so we're using these as a distraction. Instead of delivering on healthy schools and happy kids, happy families, we are trying to restrict the rights of some and create a false equivalence. This is not about parents versus kids. This is about creating a school environment where all kids have the freedom to be themselves, are treated with dignity, and raised in healthy communities. But when we see politicians engaging with this divisive rhetoric, it cues to that playground bully that they can do the same. It encourages people to walk up to and sometimes cross that line. And I think we've seen that across Canada with the rise of anti-2SLGI plus hate. In particular, the use and the preemptive use of the notwithstanding clause gives me great concern. I think in Saskatchewan, prior to allowing a court to review and to look at the policies of Premier Moe, we saw this clause used. And it actually means that one of the few checks and balances on government is now overridden. And it creates an environment where, again, we're not able to have the conversations that are nuanced, that do require expert input on the best interests of kids and the best interests of families. It becomes a whack-a-mole or a sledgehammer using a slogan to ram through legislation and policies that restrict the freedom of trans kids and their families. I think every day about the kid who isn't fortunate enough to be safe at home, who has their one space where they're able to be themselves, their school, taken away by a government that is pretending to be invested in the well-being of families, but is actually cueing their support to an anti-LGBTQ lobby that wants to take my rights away and force my community back into the closet. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the question. And the question is on impact, so I'll answer it in two parts. First, the impact of the law of Bill 21, and then the impact of the notwithstanding clause. So just to give us context about what we're talking about, we have a law that says that Muslims, Jews, and Sikhs who wear religious symbols cannot become teachers in Quebec, right? That's the law. So the impact of this was explained both in court and in a study that followed our court appearance, right? So a report found that 1 in 5 Muslim women in Quebec have experienced physical threats or aggression at work, and 54% of Quebec Muslim women have heard racist or prejudicial remarks about their religious identity from their colleagues at work, as compared to 9% of the general population. When we were in court, the court heard from many witnesses as to the harms they endured. Women teacher candidates, most of them Muslim, lost their jobs and vocations. An aspiring Crown prosecutor had their plans derailed. I know of people on personal levels who have been impacted by the bill. Individuals expressed concern about their financial security, fears for the future of their children, and many Muslim women described increasing incidents of verbal and physical harassment against them in public spaces. One woman, overcome with emotion, simply wept on the stand as she described how it felt to be excluded from a society that she had once been seen as a model of acceptance. So that's when we're talking about impact of Bill 21. When we talk about the impact of the notwithstanding clause, I mean, it's clear in just looking at how readily other provinces are now to either use or threaten the use of this clause to pass populist legislation. Wielding this power in this way threatens the very fabric of our rights, reducing them from inalienable fundamental human rights to mere permissions that are granted and taken away at whims. So that's kind of an impact. I'll leave it at that.
Okay. There's been a lot of work done on anti-Palestinian racism and how that's fallen into this idea, this rubric around hate speech and challenging the norms around or the idea of being able to and you, I think, Ms. Al-Azam, you specifically referenced that in your testimony about those fired from jobs because of it. Could you give some examples of that from further examples of that and the dangers of what that means over the past year? Can you talk about Palestinian suppression as well as a
absolutely. Yeah, I thank you for the question. So this committee has heard many people in other sessions as well, such as, for example, Dr. Yapangi, for example, providing firsthand accounts of some of what we call this Palestine suppression. And for my role at NCC, I'm hearing from Muslim Canadians and other Canadians across the country. I've seen instances about regarding Palestine suppression from disproportionate police response at protests, including physical force against pregnant women who were doing nothing more than peacefully participating in a protest, as is their right, to censorship of Palestinian content online, whether that's being shadow banned or other forms of online suppression, to such egregious suppression as folks who have lost their jobs, as you made reference to, and their livelihoods for either being Palestinian, speaking in support of Palestine, or I've seen some cases literally of just quoting scripture or speaking in Arabic, and they have lost their jobs as a result. These are real cases that we've seen here in Canada from real, that's what's happening on the ground. And we've seen lawyers publicly advocate that students shouldn't be employed. We've seen forced attestation letters to make students distance themselves from student movements. And as the Superior Court of Justice found earlier this year, the fears around the risk of a new form of McCarthyism are not without foundation. That this has serious implications for the robustness of what our expression freedoms mean, what they mean, and what they mean for people who hold them, right? And this is all kind of linked into this greater...
Thank you. Can we wrap up?
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you, Ms. Matheson. The second round, which is a 5-minute round, and I begin with Mr. Kurak for the Conservatives. Damien, 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Father De Souza, thank you for your testimony. I know you've written extensively across a whole host of different topics, and I'd ask your input, if you could, about how, as Canadians, we ensure that the public sphere in this country is one where we can have robust dialogue, have debates and discussions, and be able to use the old expression, sometimes just agree to disagree, as I would suggest is one of the foundational elements of what a free and democratic society should look like. Could you comment on that?
Well, there are parts of our common culture where that's not unusual. So our newspapers, our airwaves, and it's been mentioned by other speakers, online is almost everybody can say anything that they want, and there's very little restriction on it, although there's some concerns that have been raised in some legislation. But there are areas of our common culture, a common life, where that is shrinking. We've had two professors talk about the environment on campus. There is the professional bodies that I spoke about. There are other places where the freedom to speak out is under pressure or even restricted. So you have to figure out which part of the culture you're looking at. I mean, I'm a newspaper columnist. There's no problem. I write whatever I want. I don't have any obstacle to that. But there are places and professionals in our country, professors, university professors in some circumstances, medical professionals and so forth, where there's a problem. And then there's this other issue of, do people feel kind of chilled or under pressure, which, depending on the issue, can be more of a cultural thing that doesn't have a legal expression. So are there concerns? I think there are concerns, but they're not widespread. We don't have to worry about freedom of the press disappearing in Canada. But there are places, important places in our common life together, especially professional places, where it's under restriction.
Thank you for that. Now, as a man of the cloth, you're walking this line. Your faith is a big part of your public life and the opinions that you share in that regard. So I'm wondering if, and you mentioned the prioritization in the Charter about freedom of religion and conscience and then freedom of expression. I'm wondering if you could expand a little bit on how key it is to ensure, in this case, lawmakers sitting around this table, but the larger context for Canadians that might be engaged in this subject, to ensure that when we talk about freedom in Canada, it not be lost in the need to take into account that freedom of religion, freedom of conscience, and how that impacts freedom of expression.
Well, thank you. Well, there's a list in the Charter. It could have written it any different way. That's how they chose to write it, is that the first freedom there is conscience and religion. As Professor LeBlanc mentioned, the conscience and religion actually is where those ideas often form that then are expressed in thought, religion, belief, etc. So if you don't protect the inner sanctuary of the person, then it's very hard to protect the outer expression of the person. That's why it's not accidental that it's there first. They're not optional, and there is a hierarchy. I mean, they're all fundamental freedoms, but there's a reason that was chosen. And when we come to our public life together, people of faith should not feel that somehow, because their views on a particular public issue are formed in their faith, they're somehow secondary, or they're somehow less worthy of contribution, as if a secular idea somehow has greater validity because of its origin. So that's not usually a legal problem, but it is often the case, even in our public debates, that arguments that proceed from conscience and religion are sometimes treated as second-class arguments.
I appreciate that. And just one last quick question. I think I have about 30 seconds. Is that right? There are some that would suggest that specifically when it comes to discussions surrounding faith, and I hear this from pastors and priests and other faith leaders, that they're worried that there are some within our society that would say you're free to say what you want within your church, but don't take it outside the doors of that church. Is that an express? Is that what the charter means?
It's not what the charter means, because that would be like saying you're free to think what you want in your classroom or in your barber shop or in your bar or tavern or in your house, but you can't bring that into public life. People don't say that. So there shouldn't be sort of a special category that says if that's what you think in your temple or church or mosque, that's not allowed. That's not what freedom of religion or conscience, that's not what freedom of expression means.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I do not know which liberal witness I have next. I think it's Mr. Noor Mohammed, but I stand to be corrected.
Nope, that is correct, Madam Chair. Thank you. I was struck by a number of the comments that were made today about the importance of freedom of expression, particularly when it comes to matters of faith. And Ms. Alazim, when you spoke, one of the things that you didn't touch on, and I'm wondering if you could, was the chilling impact on freedom of expression of Muslim women during the time when the Conservatives proposed a ban on the niqab not long ago. Can you share your views on the sort of the propriety of a ban like that and what it actually does when it comes to freedom of expression nationally?
Certainly, and I thank you for the question. It in many ways builds on what we were just hearing about, how freedom of conscience kind of is the beginning and the inward thought, and then freedom of expression is how that ends up manifesting. And that's in fact what Quebec court found on Bill 21, was that it not only violated freedom of religion, but also freedom of expression. And so any of these, any bill that seeks any legislation that seeks to prevent effectively Muslim women or folks from being able to express their religious identity while participating in public life is certainly something that NCCM feels very strongly against, in particular in a robust democracy where everybody has the ability to be able to participate as a full member in all facets of public life. And I will just note on that NCCM did support the challenge to that legislation successfully at the time in 2015. And were we ever to see something like that in future, we would, of course, also look to litigate and look to challenge that, because we think that's fundamentally contrarian. And as I understand it, we've been in many conversations with, at the time it was a Conservative government that passed that, and we've been in many conversations with Conservative MPs who, as I understand, whose views have really evolved on that matter since then, which gives us some reassurance. And, we're happy to continue to work with all members from, across all aisles to make sure that everybody has the ability to fully show up, as themselves in all areas of public life.
Thank you. Father D'Souza, would you agree that something like a niqab ban would be ill-advised?
One in Quebec, my view is that was not a legitimate restriction of religious liberties. that did apply, as principally as the witness mentioned, to Muslims, Jews, and Sikhs. But it actually applied to everybody. Christians have less prominent symbols, but it did apply to everybody. And I think, for example, the police force in Montreal, quite recently, in the last few years, prohibited some of their presumably Catholic members from wearing a St. Michael emblem or something like that. So, I think that that you should be accommodating to people's religious expressions. There might be some things where you might say in very specific circumstances there might be need for limitation, but that would be, I think, hard to imagine, and certainly not on a general level. So in terms of limiting people's religious expression in terms of clothing, I thought I was against that.
Thank you. If I could just go back to Ms. Al-Azam for a second. One of the things that continues to become more and more pervasive as we are seeing the Gaza-Israel war continue is the idea that somehow freedom of expression, regardless of which side of this conflict you sit on, that somehow we now need to do a better job of policing what is reasonable in terms of expression, in terms of how people respond to the tragedy and horror that is currently unfolding. What are your views on those restrictions on freedom of expression?
Sorry, can you just clarify, like, their expressions for protests, or?
Well, I know, people, whether it's workplaces, whether it's peaceful protests, and I'm not for any moment condoning violence, just so we're clear.
Of course, yeah.
Because that seems to be, we seem to conflate these things. But whether it's in the workplace, whether it's positions that are taken, whether it's conversations, and this, by the way, it applies equally to members of the Jewish community who feel afraid to express who they are, and certainly members of the Muslim community, others who have been speaking out for the Palestinian cause. How do we navigate this in a very fraught environment? How do we hear each other?
Yeah, so I think that this is kind of we're coming to the heart of the question that people have been raising here at this session and in other sessions of, how do we agree to disagree, or how do we have conversations? And it really is just about, there is a legal framework for when speech crosses a boundary that we have all determined to be criminal, to, incite hate, to be speech that otherwise needs to be regulated. And for the most part, most people are aware and alive to the fact that, for speech can be, for example, hurtful, but not necessarily hateful, can be lawful, but awful, right? And that's something that is...
Thank you, Ms. Al-Azam. I'll ask you to wrap up, please. Thank you.
Okay, just responsible leadership really is where I was going with that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Linking the walking up against that sort of that line of what is hate speech, what is freedom of expression, the using of certain language, how that's adopted, how from certain far right hate groups. There are those dog whistles. It speaks to them, and it may not be outright, but it exists there. Can you talk about the impact that's had, what you've seen in terms of walking that line? We see it often in social media. We see it as politicians ourselves and how it's used against us, but how we show the leadership to fight against that as well. Thank you.
Absolutely. I think often we use simple language because it resonates with the public and it's easy. And so we have this ability to use a term like parental rights. And it creates this environment where, we're therefore opposed to parental rights, which is far from the truth. And so it takes nuance out of the conversation. And I think it forces us into a black or white equation where it's us versus them. And that is actually where a lot of danger comes in. I think that is what contributes to this environment of polarization, this environment where people's dignity and human rights is becoming a political issue when they should just be a baseline. And so I think we are seeing, conservative politicians, in particular Premier Smith in Alberta, but also I would say Mr. Poilievre federally, using this language because he knows it won't, it'll go over the heads of many folks who hear that term and it resonates with them and think, yes, of course, who wouldn't support the rights of parents? But this anti-LGBT lobby is hearing that language and they're saying, oh, this guy's in our camp. He's going to back us up. And they're going to go knock on doors, and they're going to then expect Poilievre to deliver on their issues and their priorities. And that agenda is one that sees regression on my rights, on my freedom, and sees a Canada where parents of LGBTQ kids have to be worried about putting their kid on the bus, about getting their kids health care, about their kids being safe to grow up and as healthy, thriving adults.
That distraction, what does it accomplish at the end of the day?
I think it takes away from the issues that most people want our governments to act on. My priorities in Canada from our federal government are action on housing, affordability, and healthcare. And when politicians have a hard time delivering on those issues and don't have solutions to the big problems facing Canadians, they dabble with this divisive politic. They dabble with these wedge issues because they don't want to answer questions on their real solutions, the priorities that Canadians have and want to see their government act on.
Johnson, very much. And now I go to Ms. Goodridge for 2.5 minutes, please.
Thank you, and thank you to all our witnesses for being here today. I'm going to really quickly, because I have very little time, cut right to it. Father D'Souza, do you believe government should be censoring speech?
Generally, no. There are obviously certain things like in national security issues, and we have quite a complicated jurisprudence in Canada about hateful speech. Some other witnesses made distinctions there, but I think generally no. That's why we have the Section 2B of the Charter.
Okay, alors, Monsieur Leblanc, est-ce que vous pensez que
Mr. Leblanc, do you think that the government should be responsible for censoring speech? No, I don't think that's the term you really want to use. I would agree with Father D'Souza that there are eagles who oversee what is hate speech and things that attack the dignity of people, then attack concepts of equality. So I think we already have the tools we need for those things. And in a democracy that functions, we have to promote debate and exchanges that are as open as possible, not only in the universities, but everywhere. And so do you think that the Liberal government is going too far with this? Well, you might have to ask that question of the Liberal government.
Liberal government has gone too far in censoring speech here in Canada?
Well, the first of the three examples I meant was that I used was a case where I think they were in error in limiting freedom of expression. The third example I mentioned was not; it was a prospective a recommendation from a committee that they set up that seemed to meet with approval, but they haven't acted on that. But if they did, that would be improper in my view.
Thank you. I really appreciate the ability to have a diversity of views. We've had a variety of people with a variety of different views, and yet we've managed to have a civil conversation at this meeting. For the most part, there have been some slightly less civil comments made. But I think this just goes to show that we don't need government to set the regulations and limit what people can and can't say, and that can be left to different mechanisms.